The apples were the first thing they noticed. Not the barracks, not the guards, not even the pale American flag hanging without movement beside the wooden office near the gate. The apples. Red and heavy on the branches despite the cold, swaying slightly in the grey wind like lanterns someone had forgotten to extinguish before winter arrived. The truck carrying the prisoners slowed beside the orchard, tires grinding softly through frozen mud, and for several long seconds every man in the back stared in silence. Hunger made people notice colour differently. After enough months of grey uniforms, grey soup, grey mornings and grey faces, even muted red looked almost violent. France sat nearest the edge of the truck bed, shoulders wrapped in a coarse blanket that smelled faintly of mildew and old smoke. His fingers had gone numb an hour earlier, though he still kept them tucked beneath his arms, out of habit. He watched the orchard pass beside them and frowned. There were no fences, no warning signs, no dogs chained between the rows, just trees stretching quietly over the hill beneath a pale sky. "That can't be right," Otto muttered beside him. Franz said nothing. He kept looking for the missing detail. Wire, towers, rifles, something. But the orchard remained open as the truck rolled past it toward the camp. Strange, almost careless. The gate itself looked temporary, little more than thick timber nailed together in haste. One American guard leaned against the post with a cigarette hanging from his mouth, barely watching them arrive. Another scribbled something into a clipboard without looking up. No shouting, no barking orders. The silence unsettled the prisoners more than cruelty would have. Cruelty, at least, felt familiar. They climbed down stiffly from the truck, boots sinking into cold dirt, breath clouding the air in pale bursts. Somewhere nearby, unseen chickens clucked lazily behind a shed. A dog barked once and stopped. The smell of apples drifted again through the wind. Franz could feel the younger men noticing it too. Their eyes moved constantly toward the hill, toward the fruit, toward the impossible absence of barriers. An older prisoner named Dieter spat into the mud. "Maybe they're rotten," he whispered. Otto gave a dry laugh. If they were rotten, they'd still guard them. No one answered that. They were marched toward a long wooden barrack with frosted windows and a sagging roof, though marched was too strong a word. The guards walked beside them, more like tired farmhands escorting workers after a long shift. One of the Americans even apologized when the group had to stop briefly for a passing tractor. Apologized. Franz stared at the man afterward, as though trying to understand a language he had never heard before. Inside the barrack, warmth greeted them first. Weak warmth, uneven warmth, but real enough to loosen something inside their shoulders. Iron stoves crackled at both ends of the room, and steam drifted from a row of tin pots near the entrance. The scent of potatoes filled the air, potatoes and onion broth. Men removed gloves slowly, suspiciously, as if comfort itself might be another trick. Franz sat on the lower bunk nearest the wall and listened to the room breathe around him. Beds creaked, wet boots scraped against wood. Someone coughed continuously into a blanket. Someone else whispered a prayer beneath his breath. Outside, wind moved softly through the orchard branches. "You saw it too?" Otto finally asked. Franz nodded. "No fences.
Otto stared toward the frosted window. Maybe they count them every morning. The apples? The prisoners? Franz almost smiled at that, though the expression faded before it fully arrived. Across the room, a younger prisoner named Lucas sat hunched beside the stove, rubbing his hands together. Barely 20, thin enough now to resemble a scarecrow wrapped in wool.
He had stopped speaking much during the last months of the war. Franz remembered him once talking endlessly about motorcycles, about rivers near his hometown, about a bakery his mother owned. Now he mostly stared at things silently, as though waiting for them to disappear. One of the American guards entered carrying a wooden crate filled with apples. The room instantly stiffened. Eyes followed the crate the way starving dogs watched meat. The guard set it beside the stove without ceremony. "Take one," he said plainly. Broken German, heavy accent. "One each now, more tomorrow." No one moved. The guard looked confused for a second, then embarrassed. "It's all right," he added quietly. Still nobody moved. Franz could hear the fire crackling, the sound of Lucas swallowing hard, the wind against the walls. Finally, the guard scratched the back of his neck and left the crate there before walking outside again. The room remained frozen several seconds after he disappeared. Then Dieter approached first. Slowly, as if expecting a rifle shot. He picked up one apple carefully and turned it in his hands. Red skin, real weight. He stared at it longer than necessary before biting down. The sound echoed softly through the room, crisp, wet, real. Something changed after that. Men reached forward quietly, no fighting, no grabbing, just exhausted hands taking fruit one by one, until the crate was empty, except for leaves and stems. Franz held his apple for several minutes before eating it. The skin smelt like autumn, like childhood, like the years before uniforms replaced names. When he finally bit into it, juice ran cold across his tongue. And for one terrible second he nearly remembered his mother standing beside a kitchen window, peeling apples into a metal bowl, while rain tapped gently against the roof. The memory hit him with such sudden force that he had to lower his head. Around him, the room remained silent, except for chewing. Men chewing slowly, because speed would ruin the moment. Otto leaned back against the bunk frame and stared at the ceiling. "Imagine guarding apples with no fence," he murmured. Dieter snorted softly. "Imagine having enough apples not to care." But Franz kept thinking about the orchard itself. Open, unguarded. Impossible. That night, snow began falling after dusk. Soft flakes at first, drifting through the darkness beyond the frosted windows, then heavier ones that blurred the orchard into pale shadows beneath the moonlight. Most of the barracks slept early. Exhaustion did that. Even fear became tired eventually. But Franz remained awake, listening to the stove hiss quietly, while wind brushed snow against the walls. Across from him, Lucas sat upright on his bunk, staring toward the window. "You think they'd notice?" the young man whispered suddenly. Franz knew immediately what he meant. "Yes," he answered. Lucas looked down. "Maybe not one." "They would notice one. There are hundreds." Franz said nothing for a while. Then he glanced toward the dark window where the orchard waited beyond the snow. "That's not the point.
Lucas rubbed his hands together slowly. Then what is the point? Franz almost answered, almost explained the strange feeling twisting beneath all their suspicion. But he could not find the words for it. Not yet. The next morning arrived white and silent. Snow covered the yard in uneven drifts, and smoke rose straight upwards into still air. The prisoners were assigned small work details around the camp, repairing storage sheds, moving crates, clearing paths. Franz and several others spent most of the morning stacking firewood near the orchard hill. The trees stood close now, branches heavy with snow and fruit together, red apples glowing softly against all the white. No guards watched them directly. That fact pressed constantly against Franz's thoughts.
The Americans trusted them near the orchard, trusted starving prisoners near untouched food. It felt absurd, dangerous, wrong. Otto noticed it too. Either they're fools, he muttered while lifting logs, or they know something we don't. Franz wiped snow from his gloves. Like what? Otto looked toward the trees. Maybe they know people get tired of stealing. Franz almost laughed at that, though the sound never fully escaped him. By noon, several prisoners had begun glancing constantly toward the orchard while they worked. Hunger sharpened temptation into something physical. Franz could feel it moving among them like cold air. Even he imagined it briefly. One apple hidden beneath a coat, one quick reach while nobody looked. Easy, absurdly easy. But nobody moved. The orchard remained untouched. Near afternoon, an old farmer arrived driving a small wagon loaded with sacks of feed. He climbed down slowly, knees stiff with age, and nodded toward the prisoners without fear or resentment. Just acknowledgement. His face looked weathered like old bark, deeply lined around the eyes. He spoke briefly with one of the guards before noticing Franz staring toward the orchard. "Good harvest this year," the farmer said, in slow German. Franz blinked. "You speak German?" "Enough," the old man shrugged. "My parents came from Bremen." Otto approached quietly beside Franz. The farmer studied the prisoners for a moment before reaching into his coat pocket and removing an apple. He tossed it gently toward Lucas, who barely caught it against his chest. "Cold work," the old man said simply. Lucas stared at the fruit in disbelief. "Thank you," he whispered. The farmer nodded once. Then he glanced toward the orchard. "Nobody counts them here." Silence followed that sentence, not because they misunderstood it, because they understood it too well. The farmer adjusted his gloves. "If a man is hungry," he added softly, "he should eat." Then he walked back toward his wagon. Otto watched him leave with narrowed eyes. "He's testing us." "Maybe," Franz said. But the sentence stayed with him long after the wagon disappeared beyond the road. Nobody counts them here. Such a strange thing to say during a war, as if abundance itself were a form of peace. That evening, Lucas finally ate the apple beside the stove, while snow melted slowly from his boots. He cut it carefully into small pieces with a pocket knife so the moment would last longer. Dieter watched him from across the room. "You look like a priest serving communion," the older man muttered. Lucas smiled faintly for the first time in weeks, a very small smile, almost frightened of itself. The room grew quieter afterward. Outside, darkness settled across the orchard again, and the trees stood motionless beneath moonlight and snow. Franz lay awake, staring toward the ceiling, while the sentence repeated itself inside his mind. Nobody counts them here. At first, it sounded foolish. then naive, then slowly, painfully, it began sounding brave. Because perhaps the farmer was not talking about apples at all. Perhaps he meant something else entirely, something larger than fruit or fences or war, something about the difference between guarding people and trusting them, about how men became what the world expected them to become. Thieves when treated like thieves, animals when treated like animals, human when treated like human. The thought unsettled him more than cruelty ever had. Cruelty required nothing. Kindness demanded an answer. Days passed quietly after that. Snow deepened around the camp. The orchard slowly emptied as weather and time softened the remaining fruit. Yet nobody stole. Not openly, not secretly. Franz knew because rumours travelled fast through hungry places, and no whispers ever surfaced. The Americans never searched their coats, never counted inventory, never changed the rules. Trust remained hanging over the camp like another kind of weather. Some prisoners mocked it softly at night. Others avoided speaking about it altogether. But Franz watched the younger men differently now, especially Lucas. Something in the boy's posture had changed, less shrinking, less waiting for blows that never arrived. One evening near Christmas, the prisoners were allowed to help unload supplies from a nearby town. Bread, potatoes, blankets, apples again, crates and crates of them. Snow fell heavily while they worked beneath lantern light, faces glowing gold against the darkness. An American guard slipped on ice carrying a box and nearly dropped it. Lucas caught one side before it hit the ground. The guard laughed breathlessly. "Thanks, kid." Kid. Such an ordinary word. Lucas looked stunned by it, as though he had forgotten ordinary words still existed. Later that night, the prisoners sat eating soup while wind rattled softly against the walls. Otto stared toward the stove flames. "You know what frightens me?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. "I'm beginning to forget who the enemy was supposed to be." Franz looked toward the frosted window where faint orchard branches scratched against the pale sky. "Maybe that's the first good thing that's happened to us." Otto gave a tired smile. "Or the most dangerous." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, less like fear, more like listening. Outside, snow continued falling over the orchard where nobody counted the apples, where trees stood unguarded beneath winter stars, where hungry men slowly remembered that dignity could survive even after everything else was stripped away. And years later, long after the war ended, long after uniforms disappeared into closets and memory softened around the edges, Franz would still remember the sound of biting into that first apple beside the stove while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. Not because of the hunger, not even because of the kindness itself, but because it was the moment he realized how fragile cruelty really was, how quickly it weakened when faced with something as simple and terrifying as trust.